Hello, lovelies. You're listening to episode 56 of the Broken Enchantments podcast, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. That's me. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Be sure to check out my Patreon for next week's episode, now available. You can check out the links below. Happy listening. Don't do it, Janir ordered herself out loud. It's dangerous. Seovan. But she had to. Something inside nipped at her heels, haunting her mind like the ghost of a forgotten dream, poking at her, prodding her. Though it was against her better judgment, even though it caused her as much conflict as doing nothing, in a few moments Janir was out of bed and pulling on her boots. Their room was on the ground level, and it wasn't difficult to climb out once she eased the creaking window free. She skirted along the outside of the mansion, feet sliding in the snow and loose rocks. It wasn't far to the nearest door, and she slipped back in through an old servant's entrance. Her eyes stung with weariness, and her limbs fumbled clumsily, but her heart pounded a sharp tattoo. Every one of her quick, anxious breaths seemed to ring through the hall like a shout. She moved with no concern for who heard. Everyone who would stop her was somewhere else. For now, Janir wasn't thinking. She concentrated on the task at hand. Find Seovan, and then... She didn't know. All Janir knew was that now, on her way to him, the raging storm inside her head had calmed. She had an objective, and it felt right. Finally, Janir found the corridor. Under the threshold, a soft orange light bled through. There were a few other doors lining the narrow passage, but they were all dark, dead, and lifeless. Ahead, Seovan's intrinsic magic flared like a beacon. She stood there, not daring to move, burning to go toward the door and yet fighting a desire to run away. Taking several deep breaths, Janir felt as if she were about to leap off a cliff or step in front of a line of bowmen. Her hand shook so violently, she almost couldn't clasp the heavy bolt. Janir pulled it, only to find it was locked. She knelt, peering through the keyhole. Inside the small chamber, there was a small fire in the corner under a ceiling vent, bathing the storage room in a soft, sunset-colored glow. It wouldn't do for Amilla to put all the effort into breaking a man only to have him die of cold. Slumped against the wall, straight in front of her, was a sight that hit her like a blow to the chest. Seovan was shackled in manacles and secured to the wall. Blood stained his filthy tunic and had dried his hair. Black welts marred his neck and peered out from under his collar. His face was sunken, hollow. He sagged against the wall, motionless. Janir sank to her knees on the cold stone, covering her mouth to hold in a sob. She had never fully understood the term heart-wrenching until now. She felt as if iron claws were twisting her heart in her breast. Leaning against the door, she wept. Seeing him like this made her feel she was being torn in two, made her soul bleed for him. Seeing him like this, seeing him beaten and bloodied. Janir had heard Amilla at work. She had heard Seovan as he writhed under the touch of Amilla's carcotton. But now she was forced to see what it had done to him. She ached to reach out to Seovan, to touch him, to comfort him. Pressing her face against the wood, Janir tried to cry silently. Was this her fault? Should she have let her father kill Seovan? He wouldn't be suffering now if she had. But she couldn't let Seovan die. She couldn't. Why not? Why not? There was no way that all this was from Chetan Shrai, was it? But That would mean that her father, everyone, was lying to her. That more than anything she didn't want to believe, she feared believing. Janir. She jumped at the sound of his voice. Janir hadn't wanted to wake him. That was unavoidable now. Janir, is that you? He let off a soft groan as he shifted on the other side of the door. Janir didn't move. She remained as still as stone. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know what to say. Janir. There was something desperate and pleading in his voice that made her look through the keyhole. The moment she did, she wished she hadn't. In those eyes, a woodland creature's, she saw so much suffering, but much more heartbreaking hope. He shouldn't have hope. She wasn't here to rescue him. She couldn't rescue him. The only thing Janir could offer was making sure he would be treated well once he was a slave, once he lost everything that made him Seovan. But Janir couldn't even guarantee that. What say did she have in it? He must have seen her tensing like a spooked animal. Janir, no. Please don't go. But she couldn't bear it. She couldn't bear being so close to him, burning to help him and being as powerless as he was. Sobbing almost loud enough to drown out his pleas, she leapt up to her feet and ran. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't care so long as it was away. Anyone who saw her would probably think she was a courier on an errand. Janir ran through the halls and nearly plowed into an Argatala Morton in shiny leather armor. Panting her apology, Janir swerved and kept running. She was tired, so tired, but that restlessness in the back of her head was stronger now than ever. As she ran, her body ached and protested, but her whirling mind wanted more. Janir chose her paths at random, so long as they led her away from the dark corridor and bolted room where her would-be kidnapper was held. As fast as Janir's legs could carry her, she ran around people, furniture, pillars, down steps, through a street, past a group of soldiers doing drills, tripped, sprang back to her feet, kept running. Finally, she had to stop. Janir doubled over, panting, one hand resting against a solid wall for support. Her breaths came in serrated gasps. Her heart raced. Her skin burned with the effort, and sweat moistened her back. Perhaps she was still convalescing physically, too. Janir caught her breath enough to stand up straight and look around her. A broad stone walkway with a newly thatched roof stretched about 50 paces in front of her. The sweet, musty smell of horses hung in the air, and a number of the stable's inhabitants stared at her with large brown eyes and pricked ears. Luckily for her, the stable lamps were still lit along the walkways. Panting, Janir walked down the aisle. No people were nearby, and she was grateful for that. Janir lingered over the bay horses. She turned her back as she glimpsed a pale horse with a striking resemblance to Seovan's mare. She was not looking to be reminded of Seovan. Making an incoherent noise of both distress and frustration, Janir spotted the rope ladder leading into the hayloft and scrambled up it. The cord stretched and wavered unsteadily under her weight. But the challenge kept her mind on the task. She reached the flat surface of the hayloft floor and clawed her way onto the wooden boards. The hayloft was cramped and crowded. At least the horses wouldn't be starving anytime soon. The sheaves were stacked in neat rows with an abundance of loose straw lining the floor. Hay crunched under her feet as she pushed back between the sheaves until she was hidden from the view of anyone who might happen to walk below. Janir dropped down. Her knees made a loud thud as they hit the boards, and a few of the horses stirred uneasily. Running had driven the cold from her body, and the hay around her sealed out the drafts. Even though she could hear the chatter of the Slavish army outside the stable, she was no longer reminded of best not to think about it. Janir laid in the straw, giving over to exhaustion. She curled up in the fetal position, hugging her knees to her chest. Her heart was still racing, and the hay itched against her neck, but it was nothing compared to being back in her bunk. At last, Janir closed her eyes and drifted off into a sound if troubled slumber. "Janir, are you in there?" Lucan's voice came echoing up from the stable aisle. Reluctantly, Janir fluttered her eyelids open. "Up here?" she muttered, voice sticky and thick with sleep. Realizing that she would need to speak louder, Janir raised her head and her voice. "Up here." With that, she dropped her head back down and closed her eyes. "In the hayloft?" came his incredulous response from the ground. "What are you doing up there?" "Sleeping," Janir groaned. "Or I was." She rolled over so that her back was to the rope ladder. Within moments, she became aware of the gnawing emptiness in her stomach and the pressure in her bladder. How long had she been asleep? "Found her!" Lucan shouted. A distant voice replied. Janir couldn't understand and didn't try to. "She's fine. Tell Mortana Canistrith will be there shortly," he hollered back. "No, I'll bring her myself." The other voice shouted something back. "That was an order." Janir still didn't move. She couldn't seem to find the motivation. Frowning, she noted the bright, burning glow of the chalice's power had spread. It now flowered across the city, inhabiting thousands of bodies forming into sturdy ranks. Zamarza had begun her work of enchanting the soldiers. That must be what she was supposed to witness. Again, Janir caught the fiery, wrathful presence of the essence of battle and war. His likeness infected everything, filled the enchantment with a bloodthirsty ferocity that made her cringe. She wondered if the men could feel it. "I suppose asking you to come down would be too easy." She gave no response. Janir didn't want to go back to the mansion. That was where Seovan was. No doubt where Canistrith waited. Lucan huffed as he swung up the ladder and landed at the top of the hayloft. "Canistrith's had Mortons out looking for you." Sitting up, Janir hugged her knees to her chest. "Our aunt stalks me like a vulture, and I'm tempted to drop dead just to appease her." Janir bit her lip. "Don't tell anyone I said that." Lucan's mouth twitched. "I've said worse." He took in their surroundings. "Have you been here all night?" Janir shrugged, dragging herself upright. "It's morning, so yes." "Just 2 or 3 hours from noon, actually." "What?" "You can see why Canistrith was worried. She realized you weren't sleeping about an hour ago. If we take more than a few minutes, expect an entire battalion to come charging up here." "Will my guards get in trouble?" Janir hadn't even thought about them last night. She'd been too wrapped up in her own head. Lucan shrugged. "Depends when you crept out and who had watch." Canistrith had still been watching at that point, so Janir would make sure her father knew. Even if that conversation would doubtless demand an explanation she couldn't give. Hesitating, Janir contemplated her brother. Lucan had saved her life, and she needed to trust someone. "Lucan, did the traitors really kill 20 honor guards to get at me?" Her brother rubbed the back of his neck, letting a long breath out his nose. "Why would you ask that?" Janir shrugged. "No one seems able to tell me who they were or who their families were. I would think, out of 20 warriors assigned to the crown princess, Cerilius and Canicade would have at least heard of one." She picked up a fistful of straw and began knotting it into a tangled nest. "So, either they weren't honor guards, or—" Janir left that thought unfinished. Be careful, was all Lucan said. Of what? Can the truth really be so bad that you all have to lie to me? It might be, Lucan snapped, making no effort to deny it. Why can't you understand? Janir blinked at him, stunned. So it is a lie? I didn't say that. Yes, you did, you... Janir shook her head, pulling away. Lucan grabbed her wrist before she could argue, jerking her toward him. You cannot understand right now, but trust me when I say give it time. You will know why we did this one day. For now, Lucan let go. Please, Janir. For your own sake. He shook his head. Will you come back to the mansion with me? Silent for a long moment, Janir processed what he had said. His words fit oddly into what she knew, at jagged and oblique angles, but she thought she might understand. Pressing him was unlikely to achieve anything, so she let it go. All right. She nodded hesitantly. All right, we can go. And don't tell anyone what I said, either. Janir nodded. I promise. Lucan clambered down the hayloft ladder without another word. At the bottom, he waited for her with his hands in his pockets. The two of them walked back to the mansion in silence. There weren't many stray Slavish soldiers in the streets. Those they passed were in full battle wear and rushing to join their units. Janir glanced up at the sky. The sun had peaked between a cleft in the clouds, but the blanket of white promised another dreary and cold day. She gauged the Slavish would attack soon, invincible and merciless. Lares, the capital of Ivydown, not 20 leagues from the foot of the mountain, would be the first city to fall. A cold feeling settled in the pit of her stomach at that thought. Janir gulped and tried not to remember what Velasquez had said. She followed Lucan as they went inside the mansion. Here, too, everyone appeared busy. Argatolums rushed this way and that, seeing to last-minute duties. Lucan led her up a set of winding staircases to the 3rd level of the mansion. Though she wasn't sure where he was taking her, Janir followed after him unquestioningly. She had nothing better to do, and so long as she was concentrating on getting wherever they were going, she couldn't think about anything else. She'd also need to slip off to relieve herself at some point, but didn't think Lucan would trust her wandering away on her own right now. He took her to a balcony with crumbling rails, but it otherwise looked sturdy enough. Ceruleus was there, along with Amilla, Canicade, and Canistrith. The Lord Argatolum was strangely absent. There were a few other Argatolums, too, familiar faces that she had seen before, but remained unnamed. Canistrith shot her a look of pure disapproval, lingering on Lucan at her side. Janir was glad that the other Argatolums were there. She doubted Canistrith would confront her in public. Janir didn't want more conflict at the moment. There was already too much of it inside her. Taking up a default position between Lucan and Ceruleus, Janir stared into the growing light. Most of the Argatolums stood silently, and those that spoke in hushed voices. It was as if they were all waiting for some great show to begin, and didn't want to interrupt the performance. Ceruleus cast a questioning glance to Lucan, but when he realized Janir had seen, he straightened, almost severely. From the balcony, they could see the rows and rows of Slavish ranks. The army looked even more menacing with the waxing dawn revealing their numbers. The feeling of anticipation, laced with a hint of unease, hung in the air like a wafting mist that sent chills down Janir's spine. Raw, untamed power engulfed and billowed off the men in the city, smoking from the chalice not far from here in its little room. Just as it had always been, there was something besides power there, something besides strength. For Janir, there was no doubt that the chalice bore Mulvron's blood. There was a piece of him in it. The essence of battle and war, it had to be. Pure, distilled fire. Simmering bloodlust, flaming wrath, a burning desire for violence. Janir resisted the impulse to shrink away. The enchantment is
powerful, Ceruleus supplied. There is very little magic in the world strong enough to give off ideas the way this one does. Feeling that, you wonder how the dog managed to get himself wounded in the first place.
So Ceruleus also sensed Mulvrin's presence in the enchantment. Janir began to think that perhaps Mulvrin's attacker was called the clever elvish warrior for a very good reason. The anger, the rage that Janir had felt. It was like looking into a demon's soul. Do you think Zamarza can feel it the way we can? Janir wondered.
Ceruleus shrugged. Probably.
He didn't seem to care.
But you can sense all that? Without trying?
Janir nodded, the fiery power blazing in her awareness like a wild inferno.
Amazing.
Ceruleus folded his arms across his chest.
Absolutely amazing.
She'd been meaning to say something to him, and she decided that now was as good a time as any. Thanks. Janir piped up, awkwardly, keeping her voice down. For last night, I mean. In the dim light of the hallway, Janir couldn't make out his expression.
Don't mention it. Mulvrin's not a bloke I'd want to cross. Canacade chuckled.
Lucan remained quiet. Janir smiled, but didn't say anything. Her head was still roiling with what her brother had inadvertently revealed. Kicking a few stray rocks on the ground, Janir tried to piece together just how this could all fit. The ambush and capture had been a lie, but an Argotolum had tortured her. Someone who must be a traitor. Someone Lucan wanted to protect. Zaoven. Janir knew where he was now. She could go see him. Ask him. She didn't know what she'd do or what state he'd be in, but no. No, she couldn't. Knistrith, the Lord Argotolum, and Amilla would never allow it. Janir looked back up to the motionless ranks of soldiers below the balcony. Janir craned her neck and squinted, but she still couldn't see. What's going on down there? A man with a knife stalked down the front row of soldiers nearest to them. He was having each man hold out an arm before he slashed at them with his blade. Oh, they're just making sure that the enchantment worked before they send their men into battle. Amilla took on an imitation of Zamarza's sultry tones. Though why they would distrust that Brevian Bratchet is just beyond me. Canacade chortled, and even Ceruleus and Janir smiled at that. Lucan did nothing. Strahl ordered that every man be tested, Amilla explained. Oh, but I think they're almost done. As if on cue, a horn blared, calling the ranks to order. It was with a conflicted feeling that Janir watched the Slavish begin their march out of Volmaken. Part of her wanted what her father wanted. The other part wanted to save Brevia, and that part was the one that was growing stronger and stronger, like a tidal wave. When Ceruleus turned to say something to another Morton, Janir's brother approached from behind, leaning over to speak in her ear. You'll do the right thing, Janir, whether it's in your best interest or not. Lucan whispered at her side. I know we can't stop you. Chills shot down her spine to hear Carlisle's words echoed. Janir looked up to ask her brother what he meant, but he'd already turned away. Stuffing his hands in his pockets, he moved for the door. His last words came to her quiet and barely audible. It's going to get you killed. You have been listening to Broken Enchantments, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. Don't forget to check out my Patreon for early access to episodes, bonus content, and lots of patrons-only freebies. You can learn more at elizabethwheatley.com. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube. I'll see you next time.